So again, you should not be here if you haven't already looked over some of the resources. This will probably be too quick for you if you're just hopping on and hoping I will give you the answers. So this is, again, good if you've already kind of read through a lot of the resources. Okay, so speciation. Speciation is basically saying when a group, we need to know first what a species is before we can talk about speciation. A species is a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce viable offspring. So, for example, we have horses and donkeys. Horses can have babies with other horses, and then those babies can go on to have other babies with other horses, and et cetera, and same thing with donkeys. But you can actually cross a horse with a donkey, even though they're considered two different species. You end up with something called a mule. The thing is that mules cannot mate with other mules. If I have a mule mate with another mule, nothing happens. The only way to make a mule is by crossing a horse and a donkey. So a mule is not considered a species because it cannot breed with others of its kind and produce viable offspring, right? So horses, donkeys, different species, even though they can make a baby. Same thing happens with ligers, right? Ligers are crosses between lions and tigers, but they're infertile. They can't have babies. So lions and tigers are still considered different species. If you separate species for long enough, eventually they're going to accumulate enough unique mutations that they will not be able to interbreed anymore. We call that event a speciation event. When enough mutations have accumulated in two separated populations of species, eventually they're going to become new species because they won't be able to interbreed anymore. So for example, here, right, let me pull up my, of course it's not going to work for me. Nice. Okay, either way. Population 1 and population 2, if they're, let's say they're separated somehow, they're the same exact species. If you see at the top of the screen, little a, big, little b, right, they're exactly the same. But if you let things go on long enough and they're apart from each other, eventually they're going to create some mutations and things like that. Things are going to die out. They're going to be in different areas that have different things that are favorable. And eventually enough mutations will arise that they can no longer cross. We call this inability to interbreed with other species reproductive isolation. It's kind of a chicken-egg scenario, right? Where being their own species creates reproductive isolation, but you can take a species and separate them to populations and eventually they'll cause their own reproductive isolation. But there are multiple types of reproductive isolation, but any type of it will eventually lead to speciation. I invite you to pause for a second and try to explain why. If you can explain why, you're in a really good place for this focus area. The reason why is that mutations will accumulate in these different populations and that there will be different ideal types of phenotypes to survive, and eventually all these differences are going to accumulate until they can no longer cross with each other. One type of isolation is called geographic. It's where they cannot access each other. So at the top is where this salamander species came from originally, and they spread southward on both sides of this mountain range in the middle. And eventually, it was so much time passed that they accumulated a bunch of differences that when they meet again at the bottom, where you see that little pink bit there, even though the populations can intersect again, they can no longer cross with each other because they've accumulated so many differences. That would be an example of geographic isolation leading to speciation. Gene flow is a concept we talked about before, but the only place where gene flow occurs is actually at the top in the range of the green section, because they're the only ones that can share populations or share individuals amongst populations and still mate. So again, why did these organisms speciate? It's because they were geographically isolated. They accumulated mutations until they could no longer breed with each other. Another type would be considered behavioral. This is where because they act so differently, they're not attracted to each other and they're not going to mate. An example is the eastern and western meadowlark. They look basically identical. But if you listen to the song, let's see if I can get that to play. Is it not going to play for me? There it is. That's the western meadowlark. Let's hear it one more time. As opposed to the eastern meadowlark. They may have similar calls, but they're different, and for whatever reason, that leads western meadowlarks to think that eastern meadowlarks are crass and crude and not worth bothering with, even though they look the same. Another type of isolation is called mechanical. This one's fairly self-explanatory. Basically, one key does not fit another lock. And in that sense, they can't have babies because they just don't fit in order to have that baby. For example, even though a Great Dane and a Chihuahua are technically the same species, they're so far apart, excuse me, they're basically verging on speciation. The last type is called temporal. Temporal isolation just basically means they mate at different times, and because they mate at different times, they're going to be different species. The wood frog, leopard frog are going to mate at different times, so they won't really interact as much. Changing environments lead to formation of new species because as these mutations are accumulating, right, different environments will select for different optimal things. So on the bar on the left, we see the current environment of this little organism. The normal gene sequence in this situation would survive better because it's yellow. It blends in better with the environment. It's all good. The red dots are going to stick out. They're easier to be seen and hunted down, killed, etc., etc., etc. But let's say the environment changes. What would now survive better? The yellow would suddenly be easier to pick out and it would die off and would no longer be as ideal for the environment, whereas the red would now survive. However, if that mutation hadn't happened, if there had been no red mutation, everyone would just die out. That's what we call an extinction, is when there's not enough variation in the population to keep up with the changes. But often, there's just enough variation to allow for the species to continue to survive. Excuse me. So genetic diversity, this should be obvious how it protects a species. If we look at the clone army from Star Wars, every single one of these individuals supposedly is a clone of one another. Let's say they invade a swampland area, all beautiful and majestic, with one slight problem. It's full of mosquitoes carrying malaria. And it just so happens that the individual that you cloned is very susceptible to malaria. What do you think is going to happen? They're all going to die, right? So when every single organism is at the same level of genetic variation, they're all about the same, then they're not likely to survive changes. They can't go into different environments. If environments change, it's going to be a hard time. That bell has perfect timing, and my alarm has perfect timing. Let's shut those off. All right. So genetic variety protects against changes in the environment, right? If there's a lot of variety in these stormtroopers and these clones of each other, then they would be able to survive the environment because some of them might die to malaria, but others would have some variations that would help them survive. That's kind of the problem with species dying off over time. If we follow this line, as the population size drops and goes through what's called a bottleneck event, where there's a very small amount of organisms left in the population, the genetic variation is going to drop heavily. And even if they start to recover, the amount of variation that was in the population before has mostly gone away. So they're less able to survive changes in their environment if they've already gone through a hard bottleneck event before. This is kind of the danger of what's going on now. If we continue to increase our, because this doesn't only apply on the scale of a species, this also includes the scale of an ecosystem. If we can preserve a large number of species diversity, that will also help protect our ecosystems when things change and we live in a more stable environment. This is a graph kind of showing how if we do efforts now, right, we can not have such a bottlenecking event. But if we wait too long to try to save some of this species diversity, we're going to lose a lot of that genetic diversity we need to protect our ecosystems and protect us as humans living in those ecosystems.